Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone once again to a very topical and very timely webinar. This one is particularly precious to me because we have here with us one of the very, very few people in Washington whom I respect and whose halo has never tarnished, and who I think of as a role model, Ambassador Richard Schifter. Ambassador Richard Schifter was born in Vienna on July 23rd, 1923, into a Jewish family from Poland. And as you can imagine, his life was dramatically disturbed by the event of the Anschluss. And when that occurred, his parents tried to get visas for the entire family to emigrate, but unfortunately, Richard was the only one to obtain a visa. When they put him on the train to Vienna, that was the last and final time that he saw his parents. Upon graduation from the City College of New York, Richard joined the US Armed Forces and served as one of the famous Ritchie Boys, the group of young Jewish refugees from Germany who were trained in psychological techniques and was able to get valuable information from the Nazis. After that, he went, was it to Yale Law School? And joined Fried Frank Harris Shriver. And prior to forming the American Jewish International Relations Institute, Richard served as the ambassador to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and deputy US representative to the UN Security Council and Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. Knowing very well what goes on in the United Nations, Richard felt it was very, very important to form an organization whose singular mission has been to break the voting bloc within the United Nations against both the United States and Israel, called AJIRI, the American Jewish International Relations Institute. And Richard works tirelessly on that issue together with his very able assistant or associate Gil Capen. And I'm very pleased to find out that very shortly they're going to be merging with B'nai B'rith, one of the oldest Jewish organizations in the United States, which works under the very, very fine guidelines of Dan Mariashin. So let's begin with Ambassador Richard Schifter. This week marks the opening of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. And he's going to speak a little bit about the mission of AJIRI, why he formed it, and essentially how he goes about accomplishing this behemoth task. Ambassador?
Well, thank you very much. And let me start out by saying that I certainly admire what you have accomplished over the years and how effective EMET is working. That has been your responsibility and your task, and you have performed it wonderfully. Now, let me start my comments. Yesterday, a truly historic event took place in the White House. Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates joined with Israel in signing agreements that herald a truly warm peace between these two Arab countries and Israel. The word from the leaderships of quite a number of other Arab countries appears to welcome that development. We are witnessing a truly profound change in the relationship between Israel and its Arab neighbors. But there's one exception. There's no positive change in the relations of the Palestinians and Israel. On the contrary, Palestinian leaders have been vehemently critical of these recent developments, declaring the action of Bahrain and the UAE to be stabs in the back. For all people of goodwill, for all those that are hoping that now that 72 years have expired since Israel declared itself an independent state, we should be able to live at peace. The Bahrain UAE news was indeed encouraging. But the Palestinian reaction was greatly disappointing. The question remains, what can be done to attain a genuine Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement? Israel has offered a series of peace proposals. The Palestinian side has not put forward a proposal of its own. A careful analysis of the Palestinian performance in the field of international relations has, however, made it quite clear as to what its position is. It is not prepared to recognize the existence of a majority Jewish state in the region. Its goal is the one-state solution, the Palestinian state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Rejection of the existence of a majority Jewish state in the Levant was, of course, the position of the Arab League in 1947, when the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution calling for the creation of an Arab state and a Jewish state in the Mandate of Palestine. It was the League's position when it went to war against Israel in 1948, and again in 1967 and 1973. The League's basic approach was spelled out in its 1967 Three No's of Khartoum.
Excuse me, Ambassador, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we're getting a lot of comments that you need to speak up a bit. Can you speak a bit louder?
I'm sorry. Make
Okay.
it louder.
Okay, thank you.
Meeting in September of that year, 1967, in the capital of Sudan, the League declared no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with it. We are now witnessing a profound change in the Arab world. In recent decades, as new generations of leaders took charge, the goal of ending Israel's existence and ending a Jewish presence in the region began to fade out. Given that reality, what holds the Palestinians back from joining those Arabs who want peace? There's a very regrettable answer to this question. The Palestinian demand for the so-called right of return. The demand for Israel to admit the mass migration of 5.5 million so-called Palestinian refugees has for many decades had the support of the United Nations system. Given the UN system's support of an end to the existence of the State of Israel, how can one expect the Palestinian leadership to change its position and be prepared to accept a two-state solution? Under the Charter, its Charter of the United Nations' very purpose is to maintain international peace and security. What is worth remembering is that it was in keeping with that key reason for the very existence of the United Nations that the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 181 in 1947 by a vote of 33 to 13. Resolution 181 called for the partition of the United Nations mandate for Palestine between an Arab state, a Jewish state, and a corpus separatum for Jerusalem. It was done in the hope that partition would assure a peaceful future for the area. As we know, that is not what happened. The Jewish Agency accepted the partition resolution and proceeded with the establishment of Israel. But the Arab side refused to accept the existence of a Jewish state. When the State of Israel was established on May 14, 1948, the neighboring Arab states went to war against it. Israel prevailed, and in 1949, a series of armistice agreements were signed. The armistice demarcation lines became later known as the 1967 borders. It was the 1948 war that created the problem with which we are dealing today. In the months prior to the war, Arab broadcasts to Israel, or the future state of Israel, anticipating a military conflict, urged Arab residents of what was expected to be the state of Israel to seek refuge in predominantly Arab-populated territory. Other Arab residents fled in the course of the military conflict. When the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, there were about 750,000 Arab refugees from Israeli territory who were refugees in territory on the Arab side of the armistice demarcation lines. In the years immediately after the end of World War II, it was the United States that took the lead worldwide to deal with humanitarian problems. In many instances, the United States decided to use the United Nations system as an appropriate vehicle for to provide help. By the time the problem of the refugees from Israel's War of Independence arose, the United States had already been heavily involved in European refugee issues, including the resettlement of about 12 million Germans who had fled or been expelled from their homes in Eastern and East Central Europe. It was in 1949 that the United Nations started to deal with the humanitarian problem created by the 1948 war in which Israel was attacked by its Arab neighbors. Not surprisingly, it was the United States who took the lead in creating a UN agency that would be responsible for help to the refugees from the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The new agency was named United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. As its name implies, UNRWA was to meet immediate needs, relief, but it was also to provide longer-term help, works. The relatively small number of refugees on the Israeli side of the armistice demarcation lines, both Arabs and Jews, were quickly resettled. There was a large number of Arab refugees on the Arab side of the demarcation lines that presented a major problem. Let me note that a related problem arose in the following years when about 800,000 Jews whose families had lived in the Arab world for centuries were forced to leave. They were all resettled long ago, a majority in Israel. Returning to the issue of the Palestinian refugees of 1948-49, providing immediate relief was relatively easy. Rehabilitation, the longer-term solution, proved to be a challenge. On the Israeli side, resettlement had been completed by 1954. In Israel, both Jews who had come from the Arab side and Arab refugees within Israel. But on the Arab side, it became increasingly clear that the Arab refugees from Israel did not want to be resettled, nor were the Arab states in which they were now resided prepared to agree to resettlement. What needs to be noted is that these refugees were living among people, most of whom were of the same ethnicity, the same religion, and spoke the same language. About 40% of them were in the Gaza Strip and what is now called the West Bank. These were refugees in Palestine. But both the refugees and the Arab states were committed to ending the existence of the State of Israel. So they continued to insist on arranging for these Palestinian refugees to live a segregated life and be available for a return to Israel. They claimed the right to that effect, which became known as the right of return. The United States was a dominant force in UNRWA in its early years. After brief service by Canadian Executive Director of UNRWA, a series of US Executive Directors followed. The US commitment to the works part of the UNRWA mandate was made quite clear. The professional background of each of the US Executive Directors was in the field of economic development. The task they were to perform is help integrate the refugees into the economies of the territory in which they now resided and resettle there. They tried, but they failed. The refugees did not want to be resettled, and the Arab countries in which they resided did not want to accept them. Significantly, under the Eisenhower administration, there was also a change in the US position. Given concerns regarding the Arab position in the Cold War, the United States was less inclined to continue to advocate resettlement over the opposition of the Arab states. A 1960 report issued by UNRWA's executive director, John Davies, a US appointee, had this to say: 10 years of UNRWA history bear out the fact that major development projects designed with a specific purpose of resettling refugees are unacceptable to refugees and host governments alike. It is the director's opinion that major development projects in the Middle East should proceed independently of UNRWA and without direct reference to the resettlement of refugees. There was no formal action taken by the UN General Assembly to modify the text of the UNRWA legislation to eliminate the word works and thus end the resettlement effort. The change in UNRWA's permission to limit itself to maintaining a segregated existence for refugees from what had become the State of Israel applied even in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank territories that had been part of the mandate of Palestine. To make sure that UNRWA would stay in business until the right of return was realized, Palestinian refugee status was first granted to the children of the original refugees and then to all descendants along the male line indefinitely. That is why we're dealing today with 5.5 million so-called Palestinian refugees claiming the right to migrate to Israel, including great-grandchildren of the original refugees. Let us keep in mind, this is the only situation in the world where that kind of arrangement was made. In no other place is refugee status inherited. To make sure that UNRWA would stay in business, as the years passed, education became the most important service provided by UNRWA. It was an education system that segregated the descendants of refugees from all other residents of the region in which they lived. In the UNRWA schools, they were to be indoctrinated with the ideology developed by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, who spent his years during World War II in Nazi Germany. They were taught to hate Jews, to hold the position that Jews had no rights to a national home in the region. It was therefore the responsibility of all those who are classified as Palestinian refugees to make it his or her life's goal to migrate to Israel and thus help end the existence of the Jewish state. That was the mission that people were being taught in the UNRWA schools and are being taught to this day. We need to know that UNRWA is the largest agency in the United Nations system. Close to half its budget is allocated to education. And as I've just noted, all those who have researched the UNRWA education system have been truly shocked by the commitment of that education system to hatred of the Jews and to the goal of extinction of the state of Israel. There's no doubt that any effort to advance the cause of Israeli-Palestinian peace needs to deal with an end to the UNRWA education system and the placement of the students in schools that do not seek to instill hatred. As noted, the change in UNRWA came about around 1960 without the engagement of the UN General Assembly. It was handled administratively with US officials concurring. It is since 1960 that UNRWA has played a critically important role in helping maintain the vehemently anti-Israel frame of mind of the so-called Palestinian refugees. UNRWA's commitment to cause of segregating persons of Palestinian ancestry from all other Arabs in the region and instilling in them the commitment ending the existence of Israel is the original basis of the outlook reflected in the current statements emanating from Ramallah that Arab states that recognize Israel are stabbing Palestinians in the back. The bureaucratic steps that changed the nature of UNRWA in 1960 were only the first measures undertaken by the UN system to take steps to end the existence of Israel. A basic change in the UN General Assembly followed in 1974. That change was no longer limited to bureaucratic rearrangements. It was a matter of the United Nations principal policy-making body adopting resolutions that institutionalized the anti-Israel position. What had happened in late 1973 was that Cuba's Fidel Castro and Libya's Muammar Qadhafi had decided to join in an effort to use their lead positions in the non-aligned movement to take control of the movement, NAM, a major grouping at the UN, and then use the NAM to take control of the United Nations General Assembly. Qadhafi brought the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to this joint endeavor. Though the Soviet bloc was not formally associated with NAM, Castro was able to coordinate the coalition's work with the Soviets. As it is, Cuban diplomats played the most effective role in reorganizing the UN system under Castro-Qadhafi leadership. Qadhafi provided the financial help used by Cuban diplomats in vote-buying exercises. The Castro-Qadhafi alliance was created to support the principal goals of the two leaders. They were distinct. Castro's main objective was to use the UN system to weaken the international position of the United States and to embarrass the United States whenever possible. Qadhafi's principal goal was to have the UN bring about the end of the existence of the state of Israel. The two leaders agreed to support each other in their effort to attain their mutual goals. The new coalition went to work at the 1974 session of the UN General Assembly. The issue of Israel had been put high on the agenda of the coalition's leadership. It took the unusual step of inviting the leader of a movement directed against the UN member state to deliver the major address of the Assembly. It was in November 1974 that Yasser Arafat, head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, addressed the Assembly at great length. It was at that same session that the new coalition got the UN General Assembly to adopt a new policy, UN policy, the claim that UNRWA had come to espouse the right of return. It is UN General Assembly Resolution 3236, adopted November 22nd, 1974, declares it to be the inalienable right of the Palestinians to return their homes and property from which they have been displaced and uprooted, and calls for their return. And it was 1974, and they were talking about something that happened 26 years earlier. It goes on to say that full respect for and the realization of these inalienable rights of Palestinian people are indispensable for the solution of the question of Palestine. Adoption of Resolution 3236, which made it clear that a majority of the General Assembly supported the claim of right of return, served to strengthen the Palestinian position against the two-state solution. The General Assembly did not stop there. In 1975, it created the Committee on the Exercise of Inalienable Rights of Palestinian People, called CERP, a committee which exists to this very day and has 25 members. It is a committee that makes a point of arranging conferences across the globe at which speakers are provided with an opportunity to deliver highly critical talks against Israel. CERP does not operate alone in the UN system. In 1977, the General Assembly took another step in support of the claim of the right of return. It created an office in the UN Secretariat, now known as the Division for Palestinian Rights, that is empowered to do the staff work for the committee. Operating from within the staff of the Secretariat, it is able to get the Palestinian Authority's message out to the general public, not as a Palestinian message, but a message disseminated in the name of the United Nations. It is a message directed to interested media, to non-governmental organizations, and to people holding public office. A message that denounces Israel profoundly and calls for support of the claim of a right of return. I've mentioned that the resolutions at issue here were adopted in 1975 and 1977, respectively. That is indeed the case, but note should be taken that the General Assembly adopts annually resolutions that renew the mandate and the funding authorization of the committee and the division. The next time these resolutions will be voted on will be in late November or early December of this year, 2020. There's no doubt that there are member states of the United Nations that strongly oppose the existence of Israel, so that their votes on these resolutions correctly reflect their foreign policy. There are other states that vote for the resolutions not because of their opposition to Israel, but because they make it a practice to cast their votes in a manner that expresses opposition to the United States. Cuba's vote, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. The latter may in some cases be done not as a matter of national policy, but as a result of submitting to pressure brought to bear by countries opposed to the United States. But these two groups, whose new UN votes against Israel reflect the position of their governments, don't constitute a majority. Where do all the other anti-Israel votes come from? To answer this question, one has to lay out one of the very sad aspects of the United Nations system. Votes cast by ambassadors in New York do not necessarily reflect a well-thought-through national policy. Many governmental leaders have too many other issues on their agenda and don't find the time to study resolutions that have no real direct effect on their national interests. So the decisions are left to the ambassadors at the UN. And that is why we need to focus on problems posed by the UN culture. Different groupings with different causes have operatives that work at the UN, whose task it is to put ambassadors under peer pressure. The anti-Israel operatives are in the lead on this. Some ambassadors are interested in committee chairmanships. Others would like support for one of their favorite proposals. And some, very regrettably, accept financial benefits for the votes they cast. The point that needs to be emphasized is that the resolutions with which we're here dealing are obstacles to an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. Given the influence of the UN, the Palestinians are not prepared to give up the claim of a right of return. That claim, if implemented, would end the existence of Israel. Are the heads of government that vote yes on these resolutions or abstain on them, who are not aware of the fact that they're going along with or opposing resolutions that call for an end to the existence of the State of Israel? Regrettably, the answer to this question is in the affirmative. There are a great many of them. That is why it is so important that heads of friendly governments be made fully aware of the true meaning of the resolutions and be urged to vote no. That needs to be our goal and our objective. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, before we hand over the podium for some questions, can you explain how you go about doing this with AJIRI? What is the methodology?
Basically, what is important to keep in mind is that the most effective way of sending messages is through interested members of Congress. Mind you, they're not being asked to support Israel, they're being asked to intercede on behalf of the United States position at the UN, to get the message across and to basically deal with the problem that I've mentioned. Get past these ambassadors in New York, get to the heads of government, get a message clear to them, to these heads of government, that what they're doing is supporting or failing to oppose the anti-Israel position, which is a position that is dedicated to the proposition of ending the existence of Israel. If the Prime Minister of Jamaica were asked, do you realize that you're voting to end the existence of Israel? I'm quite sure we're shocked.
Right. Okay. Can you, right.
We have to get the message across. We have to reach them, and we have to make it very clear as to what these resolutions mean and why they are really essentially putting obstacles in the way of the peace agreement.
Absolutely. This is, in light of yesterday's events, these are the retrograde voices of the past. And what's very interesting is, as you know, we were talking about this before, the Secretary General of the Palestinian Authority had written to the Arab League that they wanted an emergency session, the Palestinians wanted an emergency session to stop and prevent these peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and they said no.
Exactly, exactly. This is something that is a totally new development.
Totally new. This is revolutionary.
Yeah.
So what, in light of this, after your vast years of experience observing the United Nations, do you think that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and other members of the Arab League might actually vote with the United States and with Israel at this point?
I tell you, it will take time, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Right.
The way things work at the UN has a very, very peculiar culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have to, what really has to lay a lot of groundwork outside in the capitals.
Right.
Getting its,
Right, right. Can you tell us how you first were alarmed to realize that there's actually graft within the UN? You've relayed the story to me many times, and how things back home in their capitals among their prime ministers and presidents are not always conveyed, and that there's something else going on at Turtle Bay in New York.
let me tell you what happened. I was at the UN. I remember at one particular point, it was still a communist era, and I took the lead in getting a resolution introduced that made a point of speaking out in support of the solidarity movement in Poland against the communist government of Poland. So as far as we were concerned, we were committed to this position. And I made a point of being in touch, calling a number of, I still remember, African US embassies in African countries, and urged that they get direction to the ambassadors in New York to vote for this resolution. The resolution passed. As soon as the resolution was adopted, the Cuban ambassador got up, pointed at me, and said, accused me of having bought votes. I was taken aback by that. And when I met with my European colleagues, I said, what's this about buying votes here? They were shocked that I was so innocent, that I didn't know that that was going on all the time. And this is where they alerted me to the fact that, yeah, when you were getting all these votes in Africa, you assumed that you had been buying votes.
Right, right. Yes, and we know that there are many standing committees that get United Nations support, a great deal of which the American taxpayer provides for the inalienable rights of the Palestinians. Could you explain how many committees there are and what their functions are?
You have the Committee on the Exercise of the Animal Rights of the Palestinian People. They have, as a matter of fact, you are making a very important point. There is no country in the whole world that is treated by the UN system the way Israel is treated. And that is the result of a grouping having formed itself at the UN that uses the UN system by only one purpose, and that is to have the UN system harm Israel. That's it. And the thing about it is, it's a matter of then picking up votes and getting these resolutions adopted. And one of the things that is very important is that we hope we can finally get some countries to start changing their position, and certainly what has happened here with regard to Arab states is great significance. We hope that the message will get through to others. You see, one of the real concerns is that from the very beginning, back in 1974, Europeans decided to abstain. Now, abstain means you're not for something, but you're not going on to vote no. So this is one of the problems that we have had. And what is very significant is that last year, on the Vision for Palestinian Rights, for the first time, mind you, in decades, Germany and 11 other European countries voted no. for the first time. And Germany actually took the lead in that setting.
Amazing, amazing. So we have to congratulate both Ambassador Kelly Craft and Ambassador Nikki Haley, because I'm sure that they had to do a lot of persuasion.
Matter of fact, I want you to know it was Steny Hoyer who did it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wonderful. So I'm now going to turn the podium over to Sarah Leah Thompson. Have we had any questions that have come in from the audience?
Yes, thank you. We have had a few questions come in. We might not be able to get through all of them, but we'll do our best. So the first question we have, given the peace agreement signed with the UAE and Bahrain, can Israel expect to encounter less hostility in UN voting?
Well, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens now. We can't tell.
I wish that he had powers of prophecy.
Make a change. But let's put it this way. All of these questions are very definitely now on the table for discussion. So we'll have to see. We're really dealing with an entirely new situation created as it happens yesterday.
Yes.
Now, there have been years in preparation for that, but yesterday it finally happened.
Thank you. The next question we have, what's your opinion on the common claim that the UN is fatally biased against Israel and that therefore it doesn't matter what happens at the UN?
Well, you see, the point we have to recognize is that what it is the UN, maybe a good many people ignore what the UN might be doing, but the fact of the matter is that the Palestinian leadership keeps adhering to this concept because, number one, following the UN position, but also keep in mind that UNRWA exists and the schools are still operating, and kids that get started in schools of UNRWA this fall will be again taught to hate Jews. So that's part of the UN system still exists. And one of the things to keep in mind is the United States no longer provides finances for this. One has to encourage other states to stop it, and certainly for the United States not to start financing this system again. The system that, as I say, that teaches hatred, that teaches war, essentially.
Thank you. The next question we have, would you be able to explain why the UN declares that Judea and Samaria are occupied lands?
Say again?
Right, right, in United Nations nomenclature, even though Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, if you will, are disputed territories, they're referred to as occupied territories. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, let's put it this way. That is the term that they have been using. And keep in mind that these terms are really essentially invented by those that want to be critical of Israel. So that's what it's all about.
Great. I think those are the questions we have for now. Sarah, if you have any final questions.
I don't have a question, it's more of a comment. And that is, we're about to enter a new year. I was really blessed and humbled and honored to be on the White House lawn yesterday. And I see maybe the fruits of the labors quietly that Ambassador Schifter has been doing all these years, you know, to quietly work to create a different kind of climate within the United Nations, and certainly to be a diplomat. You have been the consummate diplomat and reached out all these years, despite the fact that you left the United Nations a few years ago, I'd say, and you have kept up relations with so many countries and so many ambassadors, and you have never, ever given up. And I think all of us, as we go into this new year, we should be inspired by you, Ambassador, and inspired because you are a role model to all of us. Your indubitable spirit of optimism and can-do-itiveness or stick-to-itiveness, persistence, has really, really, I think, shown results in the voting patterns of the United Nations. And I hope that all of us can learn from you. I know I've taken inspiration from you for so many years. And I want to wish you and everybody that has tuned in to this webinar today the warmest wishes possible for a Shana Tova, a Happy New Year, whether you're Jewish or not. And may you, Ambassador, continue to go from strength to strength with good health and to continue to persevere on your mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shana Tova.
Thank you very, very much. Shana Tova to you.